The Pueblo of Zuni is one of the largest pueblos in the southwest region of the United States. The Smithsonian took an interest in the Southwest in general and Zuni in particular. So they sent out the Stevenson expedition, which was Colonel Stevenson and his wife Matilda Cox Stevenson, and Frank Hamilton Cushing went along as part of the National Museum. And what we know of Cushing today largely comes from the decision by him to stay in the Pueblo by himself while the rest of the expedition carried on to other pueblos such as Hopi. And he ended up staying in Zuni for 4 years, which was very unusual for the time. After a couple years of Cushing being in Zuni, he's inducted into the Bow Priest, which is in many ways the religious society that is in charge of the protection of the Pueblo. He becomes, in a way, a sort of a diplomat. They see him as a kind of diplomat for Zuni. And this is what ultimately then ends up having him sent back to Washington, D.C. by the Smithsonian, being brought back, because he starts to defend Zuni title to land that a senator's son was trying to obtain, and Cushing intervened. And then various people in Washington come to the Smithsonian and say, you know, anthropologists shouldn't be intervening in the sort of the governance of the territories, and so Cushing is brought back to DC. Up until that point, people had been literally dissecting these societies, and Cushing really didn't subscribe to that. And on returning from Zuni, his writing was much more about trying to get at this Zuni perspective. How did the Zunis think? If you were looking at the world from a Zuni perspective, what did you see? And that was very unusual for its time. Certainly the historians today now give Cushing credit for this kind of pioneering approach to understanding this kind of the internal perspective of a society. He was the first person to recreate stone tools, certainly in a well-documented fashion. And now it's considered very much a standard practice that archaeologists will try and recreate some of the technology. But some people thought he took it too far. So following Cushing's long stay in Zuni, he returns to Washington, D.C. and has had portraits of him taken, and also appears at various kind of events dressed up in what he saw as Zuni regalia. But what's interesting about Cushing is that he sees this as having scientific merit, and many of his colleagues absolutely disagree with this, and they see that he takes it too far. Certainly one of his counterparts, Matilda Cox Stevenson, refers to him as a charlatan and a fraud. So Cushing is a celebrity, you know. I think everyone was curious at the time as to what were these cultures like. And then he was the storyteller. He brings Zunis back east. He brings them to Boston. He brings them to Washington, D.C. He's sort of bringing their world into Washington, D.C. in a very colorful, charismatic manner, and that's what he is remembered for. Cushing made a considerable contribution to the collections of the Smithsonian. A lot of what he collected was actually requested types of items from the Bureau. They would give him instructions on what they wanted to have him collect. The majority, about 60% of the ethnographic collections, are in fact pottery. That goes to show you the level of interest in the artistic traditions of the community, and that comes out very clearly in his collecting practices. There's a fair amount of the material in the collections that is archaeological, and this includes quite a lot of stone tools, which would also connect to his interest in the production of stone tools, his experimental archaeology. And we also have quite a lot of facsimiles that he makes. And they are listed as such, but they are his recreations of certain kinds of objects. So it's rather nice that while he was doing this experimental work, some of that actually gets accessioned back into the collection. So we have that history. Some of his collecting practices have now become very well known for how they've triggered debates in terms of what should and should not have been collected during the time. He went into some of the caves in and around Zuni and collected some sacred material that has now been repatriated to Zuni. As part of the outreach project, the photographs are duplicated and sent to Zuni, as well as some of the archival material, and they now form the basic collections for what is now the Zuni Tribal Museum.